women are more likely to get certain types of sexual harassment. That is very true. But if you look at harassment of journalists specifically, it is really not a gender-specific issue. And I think in that sense, the Gamergate narrative of supposedly misogynist harassment really became a part of this larger story. And I think it's very difficult to cover something like this when you do stories of people who say that they have been harassed and threatened. You really don't want to question them and say that, well, give us proof that you were really harassed and threatened, because then you're going to look really insensitive and horrible if it turns out that, yes, they were telling the truth all along, and you look like you were kind of compounding their misery by seeming to disbelieve them. But at the same time, I think we have to find a way to approach stories like that while still doing the basic duty of fact-checking, which is very important. And I think it's not even necessarily that you're going to say, oh, this person is lying. This person, who may very well be getting harassed, is also probably going to have a somewhat subjective interpretation of what's going on. Like, there have been claims made by people in the
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
I appreciate everything you guys are saying, but it has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
Well, we're getting to that.
Okay.
Well, I want to start there.
Okay.
So first of all...
Look, what we needed to do is set up what we felt...
Okay, well, what you set up, though, we aren't here to discuss feminism, because that's not what this panel is about. That's a great panel discussion. I would love to be a part of that.
What you can't do is say, here are 10 rules to follow, and you'll never make the mistake that journalists made about Gamergate again. What we're trying to show you is that this bad reporting comes from a particular historical, political, and social milieu. It arises out of
Okay, hold on,
culture.
before you... Let me... You know what? Fair enough. Ren and Lynn, what does this tell you?
You mean what they just said?
Yeah, what did you get out of it?
The only thing that I just wrote down was what Cathy said at the end about if someone approaches me and says that they've been harassed and it's by someone and they want me to tell the story, I actually do ask them for proof. I ask them why they know this, and you do it in a way that is very respectful. You try not to be intrusive, but unfortunately, that's part of my job. I have to make sure that I'm verifying facts. I have to see what they have. I have to try to put their timeline. I might talk to other people, maybe even if maybe I'm keeping their identity secret, I want to try to get a hold of people who might know them without jeopardizing that. But I am really still asking for proof and that kind of thing. So that was the only thing I just heard that I was like, wait a second, no, actually, as a good journalist does have to verify those things, even as uncomfortable as those conversations are to have.
I think one of the things this is getting to right off the bat is, where does Gamergate end on ethics and get into quote-unquote social justice warriors? Because you guys spent your opening comments...
Well, these things are not separable.
Right.
Well, according to some Gamergaters, it is.
They're wrong.
Mike.
There's no way to explain why somebody isn't a good person, doesn't behave professionally, doesn't behave ethically at their job, unless you understand their motivations. It is not for us. We're not journalists and professors. It is not for us to circumscribe, the adequate limits of disclosure. It is not for us to enforce rules that already exist.
Yes, but
if somebody comes to you with a rape
here's the
claim,
point, Milo.
you should say,
You can keep
when did it
talking.
happen, and start to...
I could ask a question.
Go ahead.
Thank you. This discussion is supposed to be how Gamergate is going to communicate to mainstream journalists and how mainstream journalists are going to understand Gamergate. It's a two-way street. Hopefully what comes out of this, my aspirations are much more modest than yours. My aspirations...
I think what we're trying to say is, look...
I have an idea.
Yeah, go on.
I would say that as a writer and a philosopher, I'm always concerned with confirmation bias in myself. This tendency that we have to be very welcome and opening to anything that confirms your worldview, and very skeptical and dismissive of counter evidence. So you have to fight that as best you can. And what I have found that upset me with the way some people treated Gamergate was that they allowed their prejudices in favor of a particular narrative. They allowed it Something's going off here. That can't be
It's
me.
your astonishing glittery appendage.
Shouldn't be. I think there wasn't enough skepticism about their own objectivity. Now, this is very hard, but I would just say that when you're writing a story, you have to correct for that. And I think most good journalists do, but I think when it comes to certain issues that are very pressing right now around gender, people just
We're not talking about gender.
No, but
We're not talking about gender today.
All right, but what you're asking us to do is give a laundry list of things journalists should be doing.
No, I was going to ask you
anyway.
some questions, but I haven't got that far yet.
ask away.
All right, these may be much more modest, small questions than you really want to hear, but here's one of the questions that I would love to hear you talk about and then these guys talk about. Covering Gamergate as a mainstream journalist means trying to do a lot what Len said, trying to source things, trying to get to the bottom of things. As journalists, we've covered things like Occupy Wall Street. Journalists are covering right now Black Lives Matter. These are two other movements that claim to be leaderless movements. So that's always a burden on journalists. Like, okay, that's what you are, but it makes it hard for me.
I've been doing it for a year. It's not that hard. It's not that hard. I just did the work. I don't know what you want me to tell you. I've listened to people who said that they knew.
This raises an interesting question. Do you put your reporting on Breitbart, do you say that is news or opinion?
I think each piece is very obvious. It's very clear what it is. You can tell.
So tell me, it's not clear to me. I'm an idiot. What is it?
Well, if it's a news reported piece, it has a lead which summarizes the story in a sentence or so. It's reported.
Your writing on Gamergate has been news or opinion?
It's a mixture.
Okay, well that's interesting because in the morning panel, that was a problem that Gamergate had, was the mixing. I think
it's a distraction. I don't think they really care about that.
Okay, well I'm glad. I find it interesting that this is a leaderless movement, but you know how they feel.
No, I mean, I've interviewed, 200 of them for my book, so I have a reasonable idea of how most of the most active members feel, yeah.
Okay, I just run this little blog for Airplay, and we had 60,000 unique users, so 200 is a reasonable sample size?
Well, it's a huge movement, obviously. But if you're asking us to just sort of say what journalists should be doing already, I mean, you could have got
the reason
much
I'm
less
asking
qualified
Milo,
people to do that much better for you.
I'm not trying to impugn your work. I am trying to say that your work is different than the work that these guys will do. So to do the journalism that they need to do, it can't be a mixture. So they have different requirements.
Well, I've written straight news stories. I've written plenty of straight news stories, and to get the information for those straight news stories, I simply did my homework. I spoke to people. I hung out in Kotaku in action. I did AMAs. I did all this stuff, 9 months before anybody else did it. I just did the work. It's not rocket science. It's just reporting like on any other sort of internet movement. It's all the same stuff,
No, but to be fair,
it
it does pose a special challenge when you have to interview people on an internet hashtag. But I will draw your attention to an excellent report by Brad Glasgow in Game Politics. And it's called Challenge Accepted, Interviewing an Internet Hashtag. And he charts a method for finding a critical mass of posters. Go find out where they are, listen to them, ask them, take a poll. What do you think are the most important issues? Where do you think the press has fallen down? And you will begin to get, sort of a consensus.
All right, let's take that point, something
Yeah.
I can actually latch onto for a change.
Okay.
So, Ren, if from an ethical standpoint, from teaching journalists as you do, how do you cover an online movement that it's mostly anonymous and it has no leaders? Christina is saying conduct a poll of those users. What does that get me?
That gets you the people who are in the place where you're asking the poll and who want to talk the most. There's no. You have to be scientific about something like that, or else what are you getting?
He tried. I was just giving a few bits of information about what he did.
Was this the guy who asked then in Kotaku in Action? He did the poll that was posted on the top. Is that the guy? So you're getting guys from Reddit who are active users of this subreddit. There's still a decent chunk of the world who isn't on Reddit, believe it or not. I mean, it's such a small sample compared to what you're actually looking for.
But we know as journalists, once you have a sort of sketch of the architecture of a movement, we have a rough idea of how many people are on various different social networks. We know that in order to get a responsible sort of consensus impression, we need to visit these various websites and possibly weight them
Well, see,
accordingly.
that's not obvious to mainstream journalists because
know that?
visiting a website doesn't mean, or, sorry, go ahead, Ren.
How is that not obvious?
If we're going to, as mainstream journalists, go to a website and start quoting randomly from the users of that website,
I would never
That's
do
not
that.
what I suggested. I didn't say anything even remotely approaching that.
talk to us as journalists about, we are going to cover a story. What's our
I'll give you an example. I mean, you were setting up this talk, right? You didn't get in touch with the only journalist who's been covering it for a year to ask who perhaps you could speak to in the course of who you might invite, who might be on the committee. I mean, these are basic stuff that you could do. You could ask other journalists who have done the work already. That's one thing you could do, right? It's one thing nobody did for this event. If you want to investigate an online movement, you have to work out where these people live. You do the work, and it takes a long time. It took me
what do you mean work out where they live?
Sorry?
How do I work out where someone lives?
You
want
ask
me to
them, and if they're not happy to talk to you
ask
about it, you keep asking other people. As you said, as a movement of tens of thousands of people, you're going to find people that are prepared to talk to you. But we're very driven by the structure of the way that a news story is mapped out. The way that news editors ask for a story to be mapped out. That doesn't always translate very well to online stories.
Well, that's what we're trying to do here today.
Right. So individual anecdotes aren't massively helpful. You are at some point going to have to speak at the level of popularizations. You are at some point going to have to speak at the level of generalizations, and you're going to have to stand by that and hope that that is a fair reflection of the research that you've done. You are going to have to do some things like polls.
Kathy's got her hand up.
Yeah,
and she should talk.
I think also in terms of finding whom to interview about a hashtag movement, I think you just look, among other things, at the people who are most active in the hashtag, who have a lot of followers, who seem to sort of lead and dominate the conversation in the hashtag.
Hold on. Okay, so let's take that thought.
So like a leader?
Yeah.
It sounds like a leader to me.
Well, a kind of influential member.
Somebody that's trusted.
Right.